The alarm system screamed through Outpost Kepler like a wounded animal in Marcus. Chen dropped his wrench as red lights flooded the maintenance bay, and he ran toward the control panel to check. What was wrong, and his heart sank when he saw the readings in an alien vessel was approaching fast, and their distress signal painted the situation in blood-red urgency and life. Support failing and crew dying and immediate assistance required. Marcus had worked on the orbital station for 6 years now, and he had seen his share of emergencies, but something about this one felt different, and the ship registry should have belonged to the Viridian Empire, and he had never worked on their technology before, and the Viridians were known for keeping to themselves, and they wore those sealed atmospheric suits whenever they left their ships, and nobody really knew much about them beyond the basic trade relations. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy thud that vibrated through the station floor, and Marcus grabbed his toolkit and headed toward the airlock. And Station Administrator Wallace was already there, looking nervous, and she always got nervous when dealing with species they didn't have much experience with, and she turned to Marcus with worry creasing her face. The situation is bad, Marcus, and their entire environmental system is collapsing. And if we cannot help them fix it, their crew will suffocate within hours. And we are the nearest station, and they have nowhere else to go, and Wallace said while checking her datapad, and Marcus nodded and pulled on his work gloves and told her he would do whatever he could. The airlock hissed open, and a figure stepped through, wearing a full-body suit that gleamed like oil on water in the station lights, and the suit completely enclosed the visitor, and not a single centimeter of skin showed through, and a helmet with a dark visor covered the head, and mechanical filters on the sides processed the air, and the translator box on the chest crackled to life. I am Engineer Lises, and my ship requires immediate repair assistance and our life. Support systems have suffered catastrophic failure, and my crew has perhaps 4 hours remaining, and the mechanical voice spoke without emotion, but Marcus could hear the urgency underneath, and he gestured toward the maintenance bay. Show me what you need, and we will get your people breathing again, and Marcus said, and Lises followed him into the large workspace, filled with tools and equipment and holographic displays and spare parts from a dozen different species, and Marcus had always prided himself on being able to fix almost anything, and today that skill would be tested. Lises activated a holographic display that showed the damaged ship systems, and the environmental processor had suffered a cascade failure, and multiple components were fried and backups were offline. And Marcus studied the schematics and realized this was going to be complicated, and Viridian technology used principles he had never encountered before in their approach to life. Support was completely different from human designs. This is complex, but I think I can work with it, and Marcus said while his mind already raced through possible solutions. And I will need your help, though, and I do not know your systems well enough to do this alone. And can you work with me on this? Lises tilted her helmeted head and seemed to consider, and then nodded. And I can assist, and I am trained in our shipboard systems, and together we may succeed where alone we would fail, and her translated voice carried something that might have been hope, and Marcus smiled and pointed toward the part storage. The next 2 hours passed in focused intensity, and Marcus and Lises worked side by side, pulling damaged components and testing replacements, and the human showed the alien how his diagnostic tools worked, and the alien showed the human how Viridian power systems integrated, and despite the language barrier and the different approaches and the strange technology, they found a rhythm. Marcus discovered that Lises was quick to understand, and she adapted to his way of working faster than some human engineers he had trained. And when he showed her a shortcut, she immediately grasped it and applied it to the next problem, and when she explained a Viridian technique, he listened carefully and found ways to incorporate it with human methods, and the repair progressed faster than he had expected. But then they hit a problem that stopped everything, and deep inside the environmental processor was a junction point where 6 different control circuits met, and one of the circuits had melted and fused with the others, and it needed to be carefully separated and reconnected, but the access panel was tiny, and Marcus stared at the narrow opening and knew his hands were too large. I cannot reach in there, and my hands are too big, and if I force it, I might damage the other circuits, and Marcus said with frustration, and he looked at Lises in her suit, made her even bulkier than him. And there was no way she could fit either. And maybe we can use remote tools, but that will take time, and time was something they did not have. Lisa stood very still for a long moment, and Marcus saw her shoulders rise and fall as she took a deep breath inside her suit, and then she reached up and began unsealing her helmet, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Wait, what are you doing? And you cannot remove your suit, and the atmosphere here will kill you," and Marcus shouted and stepped forward to stop her, but Lisa's held up one hand and kept working the seals with the other. The helmet came off with a soft hiss, and Marcus braced himself for the terrible sight of an alien suffocating in oxygen. Rich air, but instead Lisa stood there, breathing normally, and her face was visible for the first time, and she looked almost human with slight differences, and her skin had a faint blue tint, and her eyes were larger and set wider apart, and small ridges ran, longer cheekbones, but she was breathing and she was fine. "How is this possible?" And Marcus stammered. "And you are a methane breather, and everyone knows that. And the suits are required for your species," and he felt like the floor had dropped out from under him, and everything he knew about the Viridians was suddenly wrong. Lisa's looked at him directly, and her real voice without the translator was softer and warmer, and she spoke in accented but clear human, standard language. "And that is what my government wants everyone to believe, Marcus, but it is not true. And we can breathe your atmosphere just fine, and we have been lying about it for 300 years. Marcus stood frozen, and his mind raced. And why would you lie about something like that? And what possible reason could there be? But even as he asked, he knew this was not the time, and the repair needed to be finished, and lives were at stake, and questions could wait. Lisa seemed to understand, and she removed the bulky gloves from her suit, and her hands were slender and nimble, and she knelt beside the access panel, and "I can reach it now, and let us save my crew, and then I will explain everything, and I promise." Together, they worked with new efficiency, and Lisa's bare hands moved into the tight space and carefully separated the fused circuits and reconnected them according to Marcus's instructions, and he guided her precisely, and within 30 minutes the repair was complete, and they activated the environmental processor and watched the diagnostic displays turn from red to yellow to green. "The system is online, and life support is restored, and your crew is safe," and Marcus said, and relief washed through him, but it was mixed with 1,000 questions, and he looked at Lisa's, who was carefully putting her helmet back on. "And why are you hiding this? And why the suits if you do not need them?" Lisa sealed her helmet, and her voice returned to the mechanical translation, and because vulnerability is weakness in galactic politics. "Marcus, and if everyone knows you need special accommodations, they give you special treatment, and they underestimate you, and they make concessions, and my people learned long ago that appearing fragile is a form of power." And she paused and "I am tired of the lie, and I am part of a movement that wants to change this, and I trusted you because I have watched how humans work, and you do not care about appearances, and you care about results, and I thought perhaps you would understand." Marcus sat down heavily on a workbench and processed what he had just learned, and an entire species had been faking their environmental needs for 3 centuries, and it was perhaps the most elaborate deception in galactic history, and he had just become one of the few outsiders to know the truth, and he had no idea what to do with that knowledge. "Thank you for trusting me," and Marcus finally said, "and your secret is safe, but I think this is going to change things, and people will find out." "And what happens then?" Lisa's picked up her tools and prepared to return to her ship, and then things will change, Marcus, and for better or worse, things will change, and the galaxy will have to decide if it prefers comfortable lies or uncomfortable truths. And she walked toward the airlock and paused at the door, and "Thank you for saving my crew, and for not judging me when I showed you who we really are, and that is more than most would have done." After she left, Marcus sat alone in the maintenance bay and stared at his hands and wondered what he had just become part of. And outside the viewports, the stars continued their eternal dance, and somewhere out there, an empire built on deception. It was about to face a human-shaped problem in Marcus. Chen had no idea that his simple act of acceptance was about to spark a revolution. She removed her alien suit mid-repair. The human didn't expect this. Part 2. The Unexpected Revelation. Marcus spent the next 3 hours trying to focus on routine maintenance work, but his hands moved automatically while his mind kept returning to what Lisa's had revealed, and every time he thought about it, the implications grew larger in an entire species. Pretending to need environmental suits, and 300 years of diplomatic theater, and he was one of maybe a handful of outsiders who knew the truth. The cum system on his workbench chirped, and he jumped, and his nerves were more frayed than he wanted to admit, and he accepted the call. And Lisa's helmeted face appeared on the screen, and her mechanical voice filled the maintenance bay. And I need to speak with you privately, Marcus. And can you come to my ship? And there are things you must understand before word spreads. Word spreads, and Marcus felt cold fear settle in his chest. And I have not told anyone, and your secret is safe with me, and I gave you my word, and he meant it. And whatever complicated galactic politics were involved, he was not going to betray someone who had trusted him. I know you have not told anyone, and Lisa said, but someone saw me removing my helmet, and a cargo handler named Reth was passing by the maintenance bay during the repair, and he is from the Korthon species, and they have strong ties to several governments who benefit from current Viridian diplomatic arrangements, and he will report what he saw, and my government will know within hours, and everything will unravel quickly. No. Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the docking arm, and I am coming now, and we need to figure this out together. And he cut the connection and moved through the station corridors with purpose, and other workers stepped aside when they saw his expression, and Marcus Chen was known for his easygoing nature, but right now his face showed none of that. The Viridian ship was smaller than Marcus expected, and sleek and efficient-looking with curves that suggested it could move through atmosphere as easily as vacuum, and the airlock recognized his credentials and opened smoothly, and Lisa's waited inside, and she had removed her helmet again, and her blue-tinted face looked worried. My crew knows what I did, and Lisa said as she led him deeper into the ship, and half of them support me and half think I've destroyed everything our people worked to build, and my captain is furious, but she will not turn me over to the authorities. And not yet, anyway, and she believes we need to control how this information gets out. They entered a conference room where 3 other Viridians sat without their suits, and Marcus looked at each of them and tried not to show his surprise at seeing the people behind the deception, and they looked back at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to something that might have been hope. The captain was a tall woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, and she gestured for Marcus to sit. And I am Captain Ven, and I have been arguing with Lisa's for 2 years about her reformist ideas, and I thought she was naive and idealistic and dangerous to our people's interests. And she paused. But watching her work with you changed something in the way you simply accepted her and continued the work without judgment, and humans have a reputation for that kind of straightforward approach. Marcus sat down and felt out of his depth, and I just wanted to fix your life support and save your crew, and I did not mean to trigger some kind of political crisis, and maybe we can contain this and pretend it never happened. One of the other Viridians laughed bitterly, and he was younger, with angry eyes. And contain this, and you are joking, and the Korthons already know, and they have probably informed half the trading guilds by now, and within a day, every government in 3 sectors will know that Viridians can breathe standard atmosphere, and his name was Torvin. And he looked at Lisa's with something between admiration and fury. And you knew this would happen, and you planned it. Lisa's met his gaze steadily, and I did not plan for Reth to see me, but yes, I knew that eventually someone would, and I have been waiting for the right moment and the right person to trust. And Marcus proved to be both, and she turned to the human. And I am sorry for involving you in this without your consent, but your reaction gave me hope that the galaxy might be ready for the truth. Captain Ven pulled up a holographic display, showing news feeds and diplomatic channels, and already reports were circulating, and Viridian representatives were scrambling to control the narrative, and some were calling Lisa's a traitor, and others were demanding investigations, and conservative factions were screaming about cultural violations and reformists, cautiously suggesting this might be an opportunity. Why did your people start this deception in the first place? And Marcus asked. And there had to be a reason, and something that made sense at the time. The 4th Viridian spoke, and she was older, with tired eyes, and her name was Elderson, and she had been there when the lie began, and we were weak, Marcus. And 300 years ago, the Viridians had just achieved space travel, and we encountered species far more advanced. than us and species that saw us as primitives and resources to be exploited, and we needed protection. She continued, and someone suggested that if we appeared more fragile and more dependent on specialized equipment, and other species might be more careful with us and might, give us better trade terms and might not see us as a threat. And it worked. And the suits became our armor and our mask and our leverage, and governments gave us concessions because accommodating our needs seemed like a small price. And now those concessions are worth trillions in trade advantages, and Torvin said harshly, and preferential docking rights and environmental subsidies and diplomatic considerations, and hundreds of treaties were negotiated based on the assumption that we needed special treatment, and when the truth comes out, those treaties will be challenged and our economy could collapse. Or we could build something better based on honesty and leases, said firmly, and the current system makes us weak in real ways, and we hide behind suits. Instead of developing genuine relationships with other species, and we are isolated and paranoid, and constantly afraid someone will discover the truth, and I am tired of living in fear. Marcus listened to them argue and saw the deep divisions, and this was not a simple disagreement, and this was a fundamental conflict about identity and survival, and what kind of civilization the Viridians wanted to be, and he thought about Earth's history and the times humans had to choose between comfortable lies and hard truths. On Earth we have a saying, and Marcus said slowly in sunlight, it's the best disinfectant, and lies grow in darkness, but truth can survive anywhere. And he looked at each of them, and your people saved yourselves 300 years ago by pretending to be fragile, but maybe you are strong enough now to survive without the pretense. Captain Venn studied him, and what would humans do in our situation, and how would your people handle this? Marcus smiled slightly. And humans would probably handle it badly at first, and we would argue and fight and make mistakes, but eventually we would choose truth over comfort, and he thought about all the times humanity had done exactly that. And not because we are particularly noble, but because lies always collapse eventually, and it is better to control the collapse than have it control you. The cum system activated, and a harsh voice filled the room, and it spoke in Viridian language, but the translator quickly converted it, and Captain Venn, your ship is ordered to maintain position, and a diplomatic vessel is arriving within 6 hours. An engineer Leases is to be taken into custody for violations of cultural protection laws, and any human who assisted her is to be detained for questioning, and this is not negotiable. The connection cut off, and silence filled the conference room, and Marcus felt his heart race, and they were coming for Leases, and maybe for him too, and he stood up and looked at the captain. And what are you going to do? Captain Venn looked at her crew, and then at Leases, and then at Marcus, and she seemed to come to a decision, and I am going to do something very human, and she said with a slight smile, and I am going to tell them no. You cannot do that, and Torvin said, and they will strip you of your command, and arrest all of us, and destroy our careers. Probably, and Captain Venn agreed, but Leases is right about one thing, and I am tired of the fear and tired of the lies, and if we are going to face consequences anyway, we might as well face them for doing the right thing. And she looked at Marcus, and can your station administrator give us asylum while we figure this out? Marcus thought about Wallace, her nervousness about diplomatic incidents, and her tendency to avoid conflict, and he thought about the human tendency to help people in trouble, regardless of the political costs. And I can ask, but I cannot promise anything, and our government might order us to hand you over. Then we will deal with that when it comes, and Captain Venn said, and for now we stay together, and we tell our story before the official version buries us. Over the next 2 hours, they worked on a statement, and Leases explained the history of the deception while Marcus helped translate it into terms other species would understand, and Elder Sin provided context about the original reasons, and even Torvin contributed grudgingly, adding details about the economic implications, and slowly a picture emerged of a species trapped by its own protective lie. Marcus sent the statement to Wallace along with a request for temporary asylum, and then they waited, and the tension in the conference room was thick enough to cut, and Leases sat beside Marcus and spoke quietly, and thank you for not running away from this, and most people would have tried to distance themselves and tried to pretend they were not involved. I was involved the moment you trusted me, and Marcus said, and besides, humans have a bad habit of standing with people even when it is inconvenient. And it gets us in trouble a lot, but it also makes us good friends. Lisa smiled and it transformed. Her face had made her look younger, and I researched human history before removing my helmet, and I read about your civil rights movements and your fights against injustice and your stubborn refusal to accept comfortable lies, and that is why I trusted you, and not because of your technical skill, but because of what your species stands for. The CUM system activated again, and this time it was Wallace, and her face looked stressed, but determined, and Marcus, I do not know if I am making the right decision. But the Viridian reformist movement just went public with their support for leases, and there are protests breaking out on 3 Viridian worlds, and this is bigger than one engineer and one human mechanic. And she paused. An asylum is granted, and we will protect them as long as we can. Marcus felt relief wash through him, and thank you, Administrator. And I know this is not easy. Easy is overrated, and Wallace said with a tired smile, and sometimes we have to do what is right instead of what is easy. And that is supposed to be the human way, and right, and the screen went dark. Captain Venn stood and addressed her crew, and we have maybe 6 hours before the diplomatic vessel arrives, and let us use that time to tell our story to anyone who will listen. And Lisa's, you started this and now we all finish it together. Marcus looked around the room and saw fear and determination and hope mixed together, and he thought about how one act of trust during a repair had grown into something much larger, and something that might change the galaxy, and he was just a mechanic. But somehow he had become part of a revolution, and he hoped he was ready for what came next. She removed her alien suit mid-repair. The human didn't expect this. Part 3. The Political Firestorm, the Viridian. Diplomatic vessel arrived exactly on schedule, and it was 3 times the size of Captain Venn's ship and bristled with weapons that were purely defensive according to interstellar law, but still looked threatening enough to make everyone on outpost. Kepler, nervous, and Marcus watched from the observation deck as the massive ship positioned itself between the station and the nearest jump point and effectively cutting off any escape route. Ambassador Kelvin materialized on every screen in the station simultaneously, and his face was cold with barely controlled fury, and his suit was more elaborate than any Marcus had seen, and covered in symbols of rank and authority, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of governmental power and centuries of tradition. This station is harboring a criminal who has violated the most sacred laws of the Viridian people, and engineer leases must be surrendered immediately for prosecution, and any human who aided her deception will also face charges, and this matter is not open for debate or negotiation, and you have 1 hour to comply. Administrator Wallace stood in the command center surrounded by her staff, and Marcus was there along with Captain Venn and Lisa's and several representatives from other species who worked on the station, and Wallace took a deep breath and activated her own transmission, and her hands shook slightly, but her voice was steady. Ambassador Kelvin, this is Administrator Wallace, an outpost. Kepler operates under human jurisdiction, and we have granted asylum to engineer Lisa's and her crew, and they will not be surrendered without due process. And if you wish to challenge this decision, you will need to go through proper diplomatic channels. The ambassador's face darkened, and you do not understand what you are protecting, and Lisa's has endangered our entire civilization and revealed secrets that were kept for the protection of our people, and her actions will have consequences that ripple across centuries of carefully built relationships. Maybe those relationships needed to be rebuilt anyway, and Wallace said, and her nervousness was gone now and replaced by something harder, and we believe in transparency and honesty in our dealings with other species, and if your diplomatic position was built on deception, then perhaps it deserves to be challenged. The transmission cut off abruptly, and alarms immediately began blaring, and the Viridian vessel was powering up weapons systems and not targeting the station directly, but making a clear threat, and Marcus felt his stomach clench, and this was escalating faster than anyone had expected. They will not fire, and Lisa said quietly, but she did not sound entirely certain. And to attack a human station would bring your entire government down on them in the Viridian Empire. cannot afford a war with humanity, and we do not have the military strength. Captain Venn nodded agreement, and this is political theater, and they are trying to scare you into compliance, and but. Wallace called their bluff, and now they need to decide how far they are willing to push this. Over the next hour, the situation spiraled into chaos, and news networks across the galaxy picked up the story and the image of Lisa's without. Her helmet spread like wildfire, and debate erupted on thousands of worlds, and some species felt betrayed, and others felt vindicated. And many simply did not know what to think about a civilization that had been pretending vulnerability for 3 centuries. The Corthon representative arrived at the command center, and his name was Ambassador. Vex and his species looked like upright reptiles with intelligent golden eyes, and he had always been friendly with the human staff, but now his expression was cold and calculated. Administrator Wallace, the Corthon Unity, has significant trade agreements with the Viridian Empire, and agreements that depend on their environmental requirements being genuine, and if these agreements are invalidated, it will cost our economy billions. And we cannot allow that, and you must surrender the fugitive. So this is about money, and Marcus said before he could stop himself, and not about truth or justice, and just about protecting your profits. Vex turned his golden eyes on. Marcus, and everything is about economics, young human, and galactic civilization. Runs on trade and treaties and carefully balanced agreements, and what you call deception, we call diplomacy, and the Viridians found a way to secure advantages for their people, and many species do similar things in different ways, and you're human. Obsession with honesty is naive. Or maybe your obsession with profit is cynical, and Wallace countered, and we will not hand over someone who've committed no crime under our laws, and if your treaties are built on false assumptions, then perhaps they should be renegotiated, Vex hissed. Softly, and you are making powerful enemies, Administrator, and the Corthon Unity is not alone in this. And half the trading guilds in this sector benefit from current Viridian arrangements, and you are threatening an entire economic system, and think carefully about whether one alien engineer is worth the consequences. After he left, Wallace slumped in her chair, and her earlier confidence fading, and she looked at Marcus and did just declare economic war on half the galaxy. And be honest with me, you stood up for what was right, and Marcus said, and sometimes that is expensive, but it is still right. More representatives came and went, and some supported the humans and others demanded compliance, and the station became divided, and species that had worked together peacefully for years suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological conflict, and Marcus realized this was about much more than Lisa's now, and this was about what kind of galaxy everyone wanted to live in. The Inari delegation surprised everyone, and they were an ancient species and one of the first to achieve interstellar travel, and they rarely involved themselves in political disputes, and their representative was a being of pure energy contained in a crystalline form, and when she spoke, her voice resonated with harmonics that bypassed translation. We have watched this situation with great interest, and the Inari have always valued truth above comfort, and we support Administrator Wallace's decision, and furthermore, believe the galaxy has been stagnant, precisely because species hide behind comfortable deceptions instead of facing uncomfortable realities, and the Viridians are not the only ones, and many species present here maintain similar fictions. The Corthon ambassador looked furious. And you have no stake in this matter, and your species has no trade agreements that will be affected. We have every stake in this, and the Inari responded, and we remember when the galaxy was young and species spoke honestly with each other, and conflicts were real, but so were friendships, and the current system of diplomatic theater and calculated deceptions and carefully maintained fictions has created a galaxy of strangers who share space, but not trust, and perhaps it is time for that to change. The debate raged for hours, and Marcus watched as the fundamental divide became clear, and some species valued stability and the known quantities of current arrangements, and others saw this as an opportunity for genuine change and for building relationships based on truth instead of strategic positioning. Lisa stood at the window and stared out at her people's diplomatic vessel, and Marcus joined her, and she spoke without looking at him, and I never wanted this much conflict, and I just wanted my people to stop hiding and to stop being afraid, and now I have triggered something that might reshape the entire galactic order. And what if I was wrong, and what if the cost is too high? Marcus thought about Earth's history and all the times humans had to choose between comfortable stability and disruptive truth, and he remembered the civil rights movements and the fights against colonialism and the struggles for transparency in government, and every single one had been messy and costly and necessary. Change is always expensive, and Marcus said, but stagnation has its own cost, and it just accumulates slowly until suddenly everything collapses, and maybe preventing that collapse is worth the pain of change. Suddenly new alarms blared, and the sensor grid lit up with warnings, and 3 more ships were approaching, and smaller vessels and moving fast, and Marcus felt his heart sink in reinforcements for the diplomatic vessel, and this was about to get much worse. But then the identification codes came through, and Captain Ven gasped, and those are reformist ships, and those are Viridians who support leases, and they are coming to defend us. The CUM system activated, and a new voice, spoken confident and determined. And this is Commander Rin of the Viridian Reform Fleet, and we stand with Engineer Leases and with the humans who protected her. And we will not allow the old government to silence those who seek truth, and our numbers grow by the hour and across. Viridian Space Our people are removing their suits and demanding change. Ambassador Kelvin's face reappeared and furious. And you are committing treason in all of you. And this rebellion will be crushed, and the old ways will be maintained. The old ways are already dead, and Mandarin replied, and they died the moment Lisa's trusted a human enough to show her true face, and you can arrest her, and you can arrest all of us, but you cannot arrest an idea. Whose time has come, and the Viridian people are tired of hiding. Marcus watched as more ships arrived, and both sides were building their forces, but nobody was firing, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. And the galaxy held its breath, and he turned to Lisa's. And how many reformists are there, and how much support do you really have? Lisa's pulled up data on her personal display, and her hands shaking slightly, and 6 months ago, we had maybe 10,000 supporters, and yesterday, we had 200,000, and today the number passed 3 million, and it is growing exponentially. And my people are ready for change, and they were just waiting for someone to take the first step. Wallace received a priority communication, and she listened carefully, and then looked at everyone in the command center with something like wonder on her face, and the human government just issued a statement, and they are backing our decision. And they are calling for an interstellar conference to discuss transparency in diplomatic relations, and they are using this situation as a catalyst for broader reforms. So humans are really doing this, and Torvin said, and he had been quiet until now, and his anger from before replaced by something closer to disbelief. And you are really going to risk your economic relationships and your political stability, and just to support our internal reform movement? That is kind of our thing, and Marcus said with a slight smile, and humans have this annoying habit of standing up for principles even when it costs us, and we have a long history of backing reformers and supporting people who are trying to make their societies better, and it gets us in trouble constantly, but we keep doing it anyway. Why though? And Torvin asked, genuinely confused. And what do you gain from this? And where is the strategic advantage? Maybe there is not a strategic advantage, and Wallace said thoughtfully, and maybe we just believe that a galaxy where people can be honest with each other is better than one where everyone hides behind masks, and even if it costs us in the short term. The Corthone ambassador returned, and his expression had changed, and the calculation in his eyes replaced by something more thoughtful, and the Corthone unity has been discussing the situation, and we have decided to remain neutral, and we will not interfere with the asylum, but we also will not support the reformist movement. And we will wait to see how this resolves before committing ourselves. That is more than I expected, and Wallace admitted, and thank you for your consideration, Ambassador. After he left, Marcus realized what had just happened, and the opposition was fragmenting, and species that had been demanding Lys's surrender were now backing away and not supporting her, but not fighting her either. And the absolute certainty that the old system must be maintained was cracking. Lisa's turned from the window and looked at all the humans in the command center, and I came here 3 days ago for a simple repair, and now my entire civilization is in upheaval, and I do not know if I should thank you or apologize to you. Thank us, and Marcus said, and then help us figure out what comes next. And because this is just the beginning, and the hard part is building something better to replace what we are tearing down. Outside the observation windows, the reformist fleet and the government fleet faced each other, and weapons powered, but not firing and talking, instead of fighting, and Marcus thought that maybe that was the most human thing of all, in choosing conversation over conflict, even when both sides were armed and angry and afraid, and it was messy and uncertain and completely terrifying and absolutely necessary. She removed her alien suit mid-repair. The human didn't expect this. Part 4. The Human Solution. Marcus did not sleep that night, and he sat in the observation lounge watching the two Viridian fleets maintain their tense standoff, and ships from a dozen other species had arrived to observe, and the space around Outpost Kepler had become the most watched location in the galaxy in news. Drones circled at safe distances, recording everything and broadcasting to billions of viewers across thousands of worlds. Administrator Wallace found him there at dawn and station time, and she carried 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, and sat down with a heavy sigh. And I have been on calls with our government for 6 hours straight, and they want me to hold a press conference, and they think a human perspective might help de-escalate things. What kind of perspective? And Marcus asked, and he was just a mechanic and not a diplomat, and the idea of speaking to the entire galaxy made his stomach turn. An honest one, and Wallace said, and the politicians and ambassadors and trade representatives are all calculating angles and looking for advantages, but you were there when this started. And you just helped someone fix their ship and treated them. It's like a person instead of a political chess piece, and maybe that is what people need too. Here. So you want me to tell the galaxy that I helped Lisa's because it was the right thing to do? And Marcus said slowly, and that sounds too simple. Sometimes simple is what people need. And Wallace replied, and the galaxy is drowning in complexity, right? Now, when everyone is analyzing treaty implications and economic consequences and political ramifications, and maybe they need to be reminded why any of this matters in the first place. Marcus thought about it and took a long drink of coffee and finally nodded in okay. I will do it, but I am going to say what I think and not what sounds diplomatic. That is exactly what we are hoping for. And Wallace smiled. And the press conference is in 2 hours, and try not to start a war. The station's main conference room was packed, and representatives from 43 different species had arrived, and cameras and recording equipment filled every corner, and translators worked overtime to handle the dozens of languages and communication methods. And Marcus stood at the podium and felt more nervous than he had ever been in his life. He looked out at the assembled beings and saw Lisa's and Captain Venn in the front row, and saw Administrator Wallace near the back, and saw beings he had worked with for years and strangers he had never met, and all of them waiting to hear what a human mechanic had to say about the crisis that was consuming the galaxy. Marcus cleared his throat and began, and I am not a politician or a diplomat or anyone important, and I fix things for a living, and 3 days ago an engineer needed help saving her crew, and I helped her, and that should have been the end of it. But instead it turned into this, and he gestured at the crowded room. I have been thinking about why this happened and why one person removing a helmet during a repair became a galactic incident. And I think I know the answer, and we have built a civilization based on carefully maintained fictions, and we pretend to trust each other while actually keeping detailed intelligence files, and we negotiate treaties based on assumptions we know might be false, and we maintain relationships that are transactional instead of genuine. He paused and looked directly at the cameras, and the Viridians are not unique in this, and they are just the ones who got caught, and how many other species here maintain similar deceptions, and how many of you are wearing your own version of an environmental suit, and not literally, but figuratively, and hiding who you really are, because showing vulnerability seems too dangerous. Murmurs rippled through the audience, and several representatives shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus continued, and Engineer Lisa's trusted me with the truth, and she took off her helmet and showed me her real face, and that act of trust saved her crew, and it made the repair possible, and it built something real. between us in just a few hours, and that is what we are missing in galactic civilization and real trust and real relationships and real honesty. I know the economic arguments, and Marcus said, and I know that treaties will need to be renegotiated and trade arrangements will change and there will be costs, but what is the cost of continuing the way we have been, and what is the price of living in a galaxy where everyone hides and everyone calculates and everyone maintains masks? On Earth, we have a long history of facing uncomfortable truths, and Marcus spoke more confidently now, and we abolished slavery even though it destroyed the economy of half our planet, and we ended colonialism even though it cost us power and resources. And we fought for civil rights and gender equality and freedom of speech, and every single time there were people who said the cost was too high and that stability was more important than justice, and every single time they were wrong. The changes were painful, and Marcus admitted, and they caused conflicts and economic disruptions and social upheaval, but the alternative was slow death and moral rot and a civilization built on lies, and we chose truth over comfort, and it made us stronger and not weaker. He looked at Lisa's, and I am not saying the Viridians need to follow human examples, and every species needs to find their own path, but I am saying that truth is a path worth taking, and even when it is hard, and Lisa's was brave enough to take that first step, and the question now is whether the rest of us are brave enough to follow. Marcus concluded, and I am just a mechanic, and I have no authority to tell anyone what to do, but I know this, and I would rather live in a galaxy where people show me their real faces, and even if those faces are different or strange or challenging, and then live in a galaxy where everyone hides behind comfortable masks, and thank you. The silence that followed was deafening, and Marcus stepped back from the podium and wondered if he had said too much or not enough, and then slowly scattered applause began, and it grew and spread and not. Everyone was clapping, and some representatives sat stone-faced, and some looked angry, but enough were showing support that Marcus felt some of his tension ease. The questions came rapidly, and a Draxian journalist asked whether humans would compensate species who lost money from invalidated treaties, and a Devluran representative demanded to know if Earth was positioning itself as moral authority over the galaxy, and a Korthon economist wanted details on proposed renegotiation frameworks. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, and admitted when he did not know things and refused to claim expertise he did not have, and somehow his lack of polish and his obvious discomfort with the spotlight seemed to work in his favor, and people responded to his authenticity. Then a young Viridian journalist stood, and she was not wearing a suit, and her face showed fear and determination in equal measure, and she addressed Marcus directly, and what do you say to those who claim that reformists like Lisa's are traitors, and that we are destroying our culture and abandoning our traditions? Marcus thought carefully, and I would say that culture is not static, and traditions evolve, and what protected your species 300 years ago might not be what you need now, and growth requires letting go of old forms even when they are comfortable, and even when they feel safe. And he paused, and I would also say that your culture is not the suits in your culture. It's your art and your music and your literature and your values and your relationships, and none of that disappears when you stop hiding. The journalist nodded, and tears in her eyes, and thank you, and I needed to hear that. The press conference lasted 3 hours, and by the end Marcus was exhausted, but felt like maybe he had helped, and maybe his simple human perspective had given people a different way to think about the crisis, and he returned to the observation lounge and found Lisa's waiting for him. That was extraordinary, and Lisa said, and you spoke truth to power, and you challenged everyone to be better, and you did it without anger or judgment, and just honest conviction and do. You know how rare that is? I just said what I was thinking, and Marcus replied, and I am not good at political games, and I do not know how to calculate the right thing to say, and so I just say what seems true. That is your superpower, and Lisa smiled, and humans do that. And you speak plainly when everyone else is speaking in codes, and you act on principles when everyone else is acting on strategy, and it frustrates the manipulators, and it inspires everyone else. Suddenly alarms blared again, but this time the warnings were different, and internal sensors detecting explosives, and somewhere on the station someone had planted bombs, and Wallace's voice came over the emergency channels and evacuation protocol. initiated and everyone to escape pods, and this is not a drill. Marcus and Lisa's ran toward the command center and found chaos and security. Teams searching for the explosives and civilians evacuating in organized panic, and Wallace coordinating everything with remarkable calm, and she saw them and pointed at a display. 3 devices, and she said quickly, and planted in critical structural points, and if they detonate, they will destroy the docking arm and kill everyone. Still on the Viridian ships, and we have maybe 10 minutes, and our bomb disposal team is overwhelmed. Marcus studied the schematics, and his mechanical knowledge suddenly very relevant. And I know those systems, and I helped install the new power relays last year, and I can locate the devices faster than your team, but I need someone who understands Viridian technology, and he looked at Lisa's. The devices are Viridian design, and Lisa's said grimly and staring at the scan results, and I recognize the energy signature in extremists from the conservative faction, and they would rather destroy everything than accept change. And she met Marcus's eyes. And we need to go now. They ran through the corridors while other people evacuated in the opposite direction, and Marcus carried his toolkit, and Lisa's had grabbed a scanner, and they reached the first location and a maintenance junction deep in the station's infrastructure. And Marcus opened the access panel and found the device, and it was smaller than he expected and elegant and deadly. Talk me through disarming it, and Marcus said, and his hands steady despite his racing heart, and Lisa's leaned close and examined the device and began giving instructions, and her voice calm and professional, and Marcus followed each step precisely. And they had worked together before, and they found their rhythm again, and 5 minutes later the first bomb was neutralized. 2 more, and Lisa's said, and in 6 minutes remaining, and they ran. The second device was in a power distribution hub, and this one was more complex, and Marcus worked carefully while Lisa's monitored for triggers and her scanners showing the intricate network of sensors and fail-safes, and one wrong move would detonate it immediately, and sweat dripped down Marcus's face as he carefully disconnected circuit after circuit, and 3 minutes left when the device finally went dark. The third location was at the base of the docking arm and where the Viridian ships connected to the station, and if this one exploded, it would kill everyone aboard both vessels and sever the arm completely, and Marcus and Lisa's arrived with 2 minutes remaining. This one is different, and Lisa's said, and her voice tight with fear, and it has an anti-tampering mechanism I have never seen before, and if we try to disarm it, it's the wrong way, it will detonate instantly, and I do not know how to bypass it. Marcus looked at the device, and his mind racing through everything he knew about power systems and structural engineering and energy flow. And then he saw it, and the device was connected to the station's power grid and drawing energy to maintain its charge. What if we do not disarm it? And Marcus said quickly. And what if we just cut its power, and if it cannot maintain the charge, the detonation sequence cannot complete? That might work, and Lisa said, but cutting power to this junction will shut down life support to 3 sections, and people might still be evacuating through there. Wallace had cleared those sections first, and Marcus replied in checking his and everyone is out, and do it. Lisa's made the calculations and identified the right circuit, and Marcus pulled the manual override and cut power to the entire junction. And the device's lights flickered and died, and the timer stopped at 17 seconds, and they both sat down hard and breathing heavily and alive. We made a good team, and Marcus said, and Lisa started laughing, and the sound echoed through the empty corridor, and Marcus joined her, and the release of tension making them both slightly hysterical. Come on, and he finally said, and let us go. Tell everyone they can stop evacuating, and that maybe working together is better than blowing each other up. They returned to the command center and found that the failed bombing had shifted something fundamental, and even the conservative Viridian faction condemned the extremists, and public opinion across the galaxy had swung hard against violence, and toward dialogue, and the reformist movement gained millions of new supporters, and many of them not Viridian, but members of other species, inspired by the call for honesty. Ambassador Kelvin appeared on screen again, but this time his expression was different, and defeat, and anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. And the Viridian government offers a ceasefire, and we propose negotiations between All factions and mediated by neutral parties, and we acknowledge that change is coming whether we accept it or not. Wallace accepted immediately in negotiations. We'll begin tomorrow, and all parties welcome, and no preconditions, and she cut the connection, and then slumped in her chair, and I am too old for this much excitement. Marcus looked around the command center and saw exhaustion and relief and hope, and maybe the beginning of something new, and he caught Lys's eye, and she smiled, and tomorrow they would negotiate, and tomorrow they would begin building a better system, but tonight they had earned rest, and they had earned the knowledge that sometimes standing for truth was exactly enough. She removed her alien suit mid-repaired. The human didn't expect this. Part 5. The new beginning. 6 months had passed since the crisis began. An outpost. Kepler had become the most famous space station in the galaxy, and not because of its size or its strategic location, but because it had become the symbol of a new era, and negotiations were ongoing, and progress was slow, but it was happening, and the galaxy was changing in ways nobody had predicted. Marcus stood in the newly constructed conference wing and watched diplomats from 37 species work through the complex process of rebuilding centuries of treaties, and some days were productive, and some days everyone just argued, but they kept coming back, and they kept trying, and that alone was remarkable. The Viridian Empire had split formally into 2 governments, and the traditional faction maintained the old ways and required suits and diplomatic protocols and careful separation, and they controlled maybe 30% of Viridian worlds, and the reformist faction had elected Lys's as their representative, and they had abolished the E-suit requirement and opened their borders and reached out to other species with unprecedented honesty, and they controlled the remaining 70%. And the split had been painful, but ultimately peaceful. Captain Venn had been promoted to admiral. She commanded the reformist fleet and maintained the fragile peace between the 2 factions, and she visited the station regularly, always made time to share coffee with Marcus and discuss how things were progressing. The economic disruption had been real, and Marcus would not pretend otherwise, and hundreds of treaties had been voided in trade. Routes had been renegotiated, and some species had lost significant advantages they had enjoyed for decades, and the Corthan unity in particular had suffered losses, but they had adapted and found new arrangements, and life continued. What surprised everyone was how many other species had followed the Viridian example, and the Draxian collective had admitted they did not actually require the low temperatures they had claimed, and the Inteleron Assembly revealed their supposed sensitivity to certain light frequencies. This was exaggerated for political advantage, and the Inari had been right, and the Viridians were not unique, and they were just the first to be exposed. Each revelation sparked its own crisis, and its own negotiations, and its own painful adjustments, but the galaxy persevered, and Marcus thought maybe that was the most important lesson. And truth was hard, but civilizations were resilient, and they could survive honesty even when it hurt. Lys's found him in the observation lounge, where he spent most of his free time, and she had cut her hair shorter and wore simple, practical clothing, and no environmental suit had touched her skin in half. A year, and she looked happier and more confident and more herself than when they first met. Good news, and Lys's announced, and the joint engineering project was approved in full funding, and construction begins next month. We are really going to build it. The project was Marcus's idea, and inspired by the repair that had started everything, and a shipyard that could service vessels from any species, and designed from the beginning for cooperation instead of separation and mixing. Human adaptability with Viridian precision, with Inori energy expertise, with Corthon structural engineering, and dozens of other species contributing their unique knowledge. That is amazing, and Marcus said and smiled. And when do we start hiring staff? Immediately, and Lys's replied. And I already have 5,000 applications, and from all over the galaxy, and engineers and technicians and builders who want to be part of something new and who believe in what we are doing. And she paused, and I have a question for you, though, and would you consider being the chief operations officer? And I need someone who understands both the technical and the human elements, and someone who can work with anyone, regardless of species or background. Marcus felt surprise, and I am just a mechanic, Lisa's, and I do not have management experience or diplomatic training, and there are people far more qualified. You saved my crew, and Lisa said firmly, and you defended me when it would have been easier. To stay silent, and you spoke truth to the entire galaxy, and you disarmed bombs to protect people. You barely knew, and you treat everyone with the same respect, regardless of whether they are admirals or maintenance workers. And that is exactly the leadership we need. Marcus thought about it, and about leaving the familiar comfort of Outpost Kepler, about taking on responsibility for something that could shape the galaxy's future, and about all the ways he could fail. And then he thought about how Lisa's had trusted him enough to remove her helmet, and how that trust had changed everything. Okay, and he said, and I will do it, but I am going to make mistakes, and I am going to need help, and I am going to do things the human way, which means direct and honest and sometimes awkwardly blunt. That is exactly why I want you, and Lisa's laughed. And the galaxy has enough subtle manipulators, and we need more people who just say what they mean and do what they think is right. Administrator Wallace retired 3 months later, and she had earned it after navigating the most complex diplomatic crisis in recent history, and at her retirement ceremony she pulled Marcus aside and told him she was proud of him, and that he had proven something important about humanity, and that sometimes the best diplomacy was just being genuinely decent to people. The traditional Viridian faction made attempts to undermine the reformists, and they spread propaganda about cultural decay and tried to economically isolate the new government and pressured other species to choose sides, but their efforts largely failed, and too many people had seen the benefits of honest cooperation, and too many had been inspired by what happened on Outpost Kepler, and the old ways were losing their power. Marcus moved to the construction site for the new shipyard, and it orbited a neutral star system chosen specifically because it belonged to no one and could serve everyone, and he watched as ships arrived daily, bringing materials and workers and ideas, and the construction itself became a demonstration of what cooperation could achieve. A human structural engineer worked alongside a Viridian systems designer, and they created hybrid solutions neither could have developed alone, and a Corthon metal specialist taught 3 different species her techniques and learned new approaches from them in return, and an Inari energy coordinator helped everyone understand how to integrate power systems that previously seemed incompatible. Marcus spent his days solving problems and mediating disputes and learning new technologies and meeting beings he never would have encountered in his old job. It was exhausting and challenging and deeply satisfying, and he understood now why. Humans had always been drawn to frontier spaces and to places where new things were being built and where the rules were still being written. Torvin showed up 6 months into construction, and he had been one of the skeptics on Captain Ven's crew and one of the voices arguing against Lissa's reforms, but he arrived quietly and asked for a job and told Marcus he wanted to see if the dream could actually work. Marcus hired him immediately and put him in charge of quality control, and Torvin's attention to detail and his willingness to challenge assumptions made him perfect for the role. And slowly he became one of the project's strongest advocates, and telling anyone who would listen that he had been wrong and that the new way was better. The shipyard took 3 years to complete, and it was the largest cooperative construction project in galactic history, and when it finally opened, Marcus stood at the dedication ceremony and looked out at thousands of beings from hundreds of species, and felt overwhelming gratitude, and he had not done this alone. And nobody could do something like this alone, and that was the entire point. Lisa's gave the opening speech, and she talked about trust and vulnerability and the courage it took to show your real face, and she thanked Marcus publicly for being the first person outside her species to see her without the mask, and for accepting what he saw without judgment. Then she turned to the assembled crowd, and this shipyard represents a choice, and we can continue maintaining comfortable fictions and hiding behind our various masks and protecting our advantages through deception, or we can choose to build something real together and something based on genuine cooperation and mutual respect, and the choice is always ours to make. The shipyard became immediately successful, and ships came from across the galaxy for repairs and maintenance and upgrades in the mixed species. Crews proved more efficient than anyone expected, and problems that would have taken weeks to solve. In traditional single-species facilities were resolved in days through creative collaboration. Marcus walked through the facility daily and watched human mechanics teaching Viridian techniques to Corthon apprentices and saw Draxian engineers learning from Teleron specialists, and everywhere he looked he saw barriers breaking down in people, choosing to trust each other, and it was messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. 5 years after the crisis began, Marcus received a message from Ambassador Kelvin and the traditional Viridian government representative who had demanded Lys's surrender and threatened war and tried to maintain the old ways, and Marcus almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. The message was brief, and I was wrong, and Kelvin wrote, and I spent 50 years believing the suits protected us, and that showing. Vulnerability would destroy us, and watching your shipyard. Succeed in watching reformist Viridians. Thrive in watching the galaxy adapt to honesty instead of collapsing, and it has shown me that fear is not the same as wisdom, and I am retiring from government service, but I wanted you to know that what you and Lisa started was necessary, and even if I could not see it at the time. Marcus saved the message, and it felt important somehow, and evidence that even the strongest opponents of change could evolve, and could admit mistakes, and could choose growth over rigidity. The traditional Viridian faction began sending observers to the shipyard, and they claimed it was just to monitor reformist activities, but Marcus noticed they were taking notes and asking questions and learning, and he suspected within another generation the split would heal and the traditional faction would slowly adopt the reforms they had once fought so hard against. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Lisa's removed her helmet. Marcus and Lisa's stood together in the shipyard's observation deck and watched ships come and go and crews from dozens of species working in harmony and building. Something that would have been impossible under the old system. Do you ever regret it? And Marcus asked. And all the pain and conflict and uncertainty, and was it worth it? LYSS was quiet for a moment, and every day I meet someone who tells me they are living more honestly because of what happened, and every day I see cooperation that would have been impossible before, and every day I watch beings from different worlds choose trust over fear. And she smiled, and yes, Marcus, it was worth it, and 1,000 times worth it. And what about you? And she asked. And you gave up a simple, comfortable life for all this complexity? And do you ever wish you had just finished the repair and forgotten what you saw? Marcus thought about the question seriously, and not every day is easy, and he admitted, and some days I miss the simplicity of just fixing things, but then I remember that we are fixing things, and just on a much larger scale, and we are fixing the broken parts of how species relate to each other, and that seems worth the complexity. Below them, a human freighter docked next to a Viridian science vessel, and their crews met on the loading platform and worked together to transfer cargo, and nobody wore environmental suits unless they genuinely needed them, and nobody hid behind diplomatic protocols, and they just treated each other like colleagues working toward common goals. That is what we built. And Lisa said quietly, and not the shipyard, but this and the consumption that we can work together, and the default of trust instead of suspicion, and the choice to be vulnerable instead of protected. Marcus nodded. Have always believed that, and maybe not always perfectly, and we have our own history of distrust and conflict, but at our best, we believe that people are fundamentally worthy of trust, and that showing your real self is strength, not weakness. And I am glad we could share that with the galaxy. The CUM system activated, and a young Corthon technician called for assistance with a complex repair and something that required both human creativity and Viridian precision. And Marcus and Lisa's looked at each other and smiled and headed down to the maintenance bay. Some things never changed, and Marcus thought. And he was still fixing things, and still solving problems, and still working alongside people from different worlds, but now he was doing it in a galaxy that had chosen truth over comfort and cooperation, over isolation and trust over fear. As they entered the bay and began assessing the problem, Marcus realized this was the moment that mattered, and not the dramatic confrontations, or the political negotiations, or the grand ceremonies, but these quiet moments of beings from different worlds working together and choosing to help each other and building something better one repair at a time. Lisa's caught his eye and seemed to read his thoughts, and this is the revolution, and she said, and not the speeches or the treaties, but this, and beings treating each other like partners instead of strangers. Marcus picked up his tools and got to work, and around him the shipyard hummed with activity, and outside the viewports the galaxy continued its eternal dance, and somewhere a young engineer on a distant station was probably facing a choice between hiding and trusting, and between maintaining comfortable lies and risking uncomfortable truths. He hoped they would choose truth and choose trust and choose to show their real face. And because every time someone made that choice, the galaxy became a little bit better and a little bit more honest and a little bit more worthy of the beings who inhabited it. The repair took 3 hours, and when it was finished, the Corthon technician thanked them both and went back to work in Marcus and Lisa's, returned to their offices and prepared for another day of building the future. And it was not dramatic, and it was not exciting, and it was exactly what the galaxy needed. Years later, when historians studied this period, they would call it the Great Opening, and they would analyze the political changes and economic restructuring and diplomatic innovations, but Marcus always thought they missed the point, and the real change was not in governments or treaties, and the real change was in the millions of small moments when beings chose to trust each other and to work together and to show their true faces. And it had all started in a maintenance bay on Outpost Kepler, when one alien engineer decided to trust one human mechanic, and when that mechanic decided her trust was more important than his confusion and everything else had flowed from that single moment of mutual respect and honest cooperation. Marcus looked out at the stars and thought about all the beings out there still hiding and still afraid and still maintaining their comfortable masks, and he hoped they would find their own leases and their own moment of trust and their own chance to discover that vulnerability could be strength, and that showing your real face was the beginning of something beautiful. The galaxy was vast and change was slow, but it was happening in one repair at a time, and one act of trust at a time, and one removed helmet at a time, and the future was being built by beings who chose honesty over deception and cooperation over isolation, and that was the most human thing of all, and to believe that people were worth trusting, and that truth was worth fighting for, and that a better galaxy was possible if everyone was willing to do the work. And so Marcus Chen, former maintenance mechanic and current chief operations officer of the galaxy's first truly elective shipyard, went back to work, and somewhere an alarm was probably sounding, and somewhere a ship probably needed repairs, and somewhere someone was probably about to make a choice that would change everything, and he was ready to help however he could, because that was what humans did, and that was what the galaxy needed, and that was what the future demanded.